Welcome to 1128 Community. My name is Mike, and if you're a student, middle school or high school student, this fall we've got a discussion group happening during this time for you. Nikki's in the back. She's over here waving. If you're a student, middle school or high school, and you want to go and connect with her and get away from your parents for a minute, you're more than welcome, highly encouraged to go and do that. And for those of you that are new to 1128, welcome. I'm glad that you're here today. It's my hope that this would be a safe space for you to explore Jesus, that you would be comfortable and feel like, man, I can really figure this out. That you can explore faith, spirituality, and what Jesus might look like in your life and how that might start to change things for you. If you're new and maybe you haven't been watching us online, or maybe you've been gone the last couple of weeks because of soccer or football or baseball or just really nice weather and we only got a few weeks left, I'm glad you're here. We're in a series called The Way. And we're exploring the way of Jesus, what that means, and how that might actually change our lives if we were to live like Jesus and love like Jesus. And so, as I'm preparing for this week and this message, Colleen and I are reading this passage a few months ago in Matthew 16, and every time I read this passage, I laugh out loud, and I laughed, and I had to explain it to Colleen. There's a story that goes with it. I'm in college, I'm a junior, and I'm living with some of my best friends. We had Dan and Corey, they were in a room together. We had myself and Clark and Steven and John, the four of us were in a room together. And then we had AJ and Sam. AJ and Sam were the guys that it's I'm not sure how they ended up in a room together, right? They're the guys that are pretty opposite. And they're in a room together, and their room, I'll just say it wasn't always the quietest of rooms. They had a lot of disagreements about things. They had butt heads a lot of times. Here we are. This is a few of us. This is me, obviously, looking much younger. Sam is next to me there. Then Corey in the middle. Dan, and then AJ. AJ didn't graduate with us because in this moment that I'm remembering when I look at Matthew 16, AJ comes into our common area and he's like, man. Guys, I made the hardest decision of my life today. And Sam, having close proximity to AJ all the time, he's like, was it as hard as the day you chose to carry your cross for the Lord? And we're all just like, oh my gosh, Sam. We don't know what's going on at this point. Sam is just kind of giving it to him. And AJ's like, I'm actually going to be transferring schools. And it was really hard for him. He transferred to a rival school, Trinity, in the Chicago area. And so it was hard. But AJ, he came back to graduation and celebrated with us. And every time I read Matthew 16, I come back to that conversation and this idea of the I've got to carry my cross for the Lord. Has anybody heard that phrase this morning? Or the burden that you've got to carry, maybe you haven't heard it in a church context, maybe you've heard it somewhere else in life, and this is not an unfamiliar phrase to you. I saw a couple hands that said that. I think we've all probably heard that or thought about that or understood that in some way, in some context, no matter where we are. And when we read this passage and Jesus is talking about carrying your cross, what does he mean? What's the context around this? Who's Jesus talking to? Do you ever wonder these things when you read Scripture? Why? There's a verse there, and I don't necessarily understand the bigger picture of it. Do you ever wonder, is it just me? Am I alone in this morning? Okay, thank you, whoever that was. Thank you for not letting me be out here by myself today. The reality for each of us today is life can be hard. I think Mike kind of touched on some of the things earlier: finances, marriage, relationships, friends, family, parenting burdens. You got kids that you're supposed to be responsible for. You got health burdens, work burdens. You might even have church burdens. You might even have church trauma or things in your life that it just feels heavy and you're just carrying these things around. It might feel like that's the cross that you are carrying into this space this morning. And I think that as we get into Matthew 16, you're going to understand a little bit more about the life that Jesus invites us into. Around here, we call it the 1128 life. Like Casey mentioned, Matthew 1128 is this invitation to do life different, to do life with Jesus, to let that burden burden kind of be free, to let that burden be released. And the reality for us this morning, whether the burden feels overwhelming or it feels non-existent, there will be a time when we need to release something back to God. And the freedom that we're longing for, the freedom from that burden, it's just one small step at a time. It's one small step of surrender every opportunity that you have. The way of Jesus is upside down, and this is what we're going to talk about today. The way of Jesus is upside down. It's a life of surrender. It's one small step at a time. It's releasing the burden and saying, I don't need to carry this myself. And so we pick up the way of Jesus in Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus is there and he's with his closest friends. And the context is that he's arriving at Caesarea Philippi, and it's this village, maybe a little bit of a smaller village. It might be like everybody kind of knows everybody type of village. Not totally sure, but this village is at the base of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is the mountain that Jesus goes up in a couple chapters, chapter 17. He goes up to the top of this mountain. He meets with God there, and there's this word, he's transfigured. And if you've never heard the word transfigured before, let me put it this way. Jesus basically becomes radiant. Like he's as bright as the sun, you might think of it that way. He becomes radiant in God's glory. And so this is the mountain, the base of this mountain, where they're at in chapter 16. Jesus is there. It's before he goes up the mountain, and he's there with his friends, and he's talking to them. And people have started to ask like this question around, like, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? What's this guy about? Jesus has always kind of told them, I'm here to make the Father known. Like he's always told them that, but they're asking this more like in like I want to know more. Who is Jesus? Who are you really? And so Jesus asks his closest friends, the disciples at this point, like, well, who do they say I am? Who do the people that are asking this question, who is Jesus, what's their answer? How are they talking about me? What do they have to say? And they say, they call you John the Baptizer. Some call you Elijah, others Jeremiah. And then there's these other people that they just say you're some other prophet sent by God. And Jesus is like, okay, who do you say I am? Who do you, the people closest to me, the ones doing life with me, say that I am? And I imagine in this moment when Jesus looks at these guys and says, who do you say I am? They're like, oh boy, I do not want to get this one wrong. You ever been in the presence of somebody and they've been like, well, who am I to you? And you're like, I know there's a right answer here. I think I might know it. Anybody ever had that? Like, you don't want to fail this test, right? Especially if it's like your boss or somebody of importance. Like, you do not want to fail this test. And so here they are. Jesus says, like, who do you all say I am? And they're like, ugh. And finally you get Peter. Peter's the guy that he's always just kind of, he's going to blurt it out. He's going to say what's on his mind eventually. He's okay, like messing up and making mistakes. And he's like, all right, I'm going for it. And he's like, well, they say that you are maybe a prophet, but we think that you are the Son of God. You are the Son of God. He proclaims in this moment that Jesus is the Christ. He proclaims that Jesus isn't just a prophet. He's not some version of John the Baptizer. He's not Elijah or Jeremiah or any of those others. He is God in human flesh. It's a pretty bold claim, but that's exactly who Jesus was. And Peter had seen it. He'd been around it. He'd realized it. And he acknowledged it. And as we continue on in this story, it says from then on, so like he's proclaimed now, like the disciples, his closest friends, like they recognize who he is. Peter's put it out there. He's stepped out, and from then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem, that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. Now, last week, I talked about the Sanhedrin. Now, those were the religious leaders. They were also like the highest court. That's who these people are. The elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the law. The Sanhedrin were going to do terrible things to him. But he had to go. He had to go to Jerusalem. And now, Peter, having had this conversation and making this proclamation, he takes Jesus aside and he says to Jesus like some things that like don't maybe line up. And so Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him, saying, "Heaven forbid, Lord. Heaven forbid." Could you imagine saying like heaven forbid to Jesus? Yeah, I can't imagine this. But heaven forbid, Lord, Peter said, they will never happen to you. How can this be God's plan, is what Peter is asking. He's asking Jesus Christ, the Son of God, how can this be the plan? What are you talking about? That does not make sense. This does not add up. And Jesus, he turns to Peter and he says, "Get away from me, Satan." And it's this moment of being like, Peter, like, you just recognized who I was. Do you not, like, what happened in these, like, couple minutes in between? Like, you just said it. Where are you at now? Get behind from a human. You are a dangerous trap to me. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's point of view. Peter, do you not remember what you just said? Peter, think back just a couple of sentences. You remember, like, I'm the Son of God, right? I am Jesus the Christ. Peter, think bigger. Peter, see bigger. It's not about you, Peter. It's not about your plan. It's not about what you want to do. It's not how you think this is all going to work out. Like, this is not about your human desires or your human ideas. My way, the Jesus way, the God way is different. Come on, Peter. And then Jesus said to the disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross," which may or may not be harder than choosing to transfer schools, "and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will say it." And again, I'm going to say the way of Jesus is upside down. It does not make sense. The fact that you can give up your life to gain it, what? And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If you want to be my follower, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross. Follow me. Take up your cross. Die to yourself. Take up your cross. See bigger. Think bigger. Die to yourself and your limited capacity. Ultimately, take up your cross and surrender. Take up your cross because your soul depends on it. Your relationship with the Creator is what matters most. The way of Jesus is upside down, and what you actually think is valuable has very little value or worth whatsoever. And Jesus is telling us, like, it's going to be different. It's not going to make sense. Your cross to carry is difficult only because it's requiring you to do something hard, and that's giving up control. It's difficult because you have to give up the thing you want to hold on to most, and that's control. Any control freaks in the room? I heard an audible yeah. I saw a couple hands move. Like, that is the hardest thing to give up, especially with kids when you're trying to parent them and you want them to do it one way and they do it a different way, and you're like, come on, that's not what I said. Giving up control is hard when you're the boss and you got an employee that's new, or maybe they're not new. Maybe they've just been around for a long time and they don't care anymore. And it's like, I want you to do it this way. And they're like, I'm doing it my way. Giving up control is hard when you're newly married and your spouse is like doing something and you're like, but I really want it done this way. Giving up control is hard when you're married for 20 years and your spouse is still doing that same thing 20 years later. And you're like, I don't know. I wanted it this way. Giving up control is hard. But that's what Jesus asks us to do, to give it up, to carry that cross of surrender, to trust him with our lives, to do something that's crazy. Because the way of Jesus is upside down. And so what do we do with this? What do we actually leave here today like thinking about and saying, I've got to make some changes? How do we apply this to our lives? Well, it means, first of all, that we've got to acknowledge that we've got some control issues. We've got to acknowledge that we've got some things that we need to surrender, some burdens that we're carrying that need to be let go and released, because we can't carry the cross that Jesus has invited us to carry because of all these other things we're trying to carry. We've got to let go and allow God to do something in our lives that way. We have to surrender. Giving up control is, I think, the hardest thing in the world. But again, it's this upside down way of Jesus, this upside down way of living that we're invited into. It's finding a few loaves and a couple fish and saying like, okay, like we could feed a whole bunch of people, but like that doesn't make sense, right? Like I'm gonna give it to you, Jesus, but that's not how I would do it. I'd send all these people home. Jesus, if I were in control of this situation, I'd send these people home because I don't actually believe that your way, these couple fish and loaves of bread, like I don't think they can feed thousands of people. Surrender and giving up control, it's hanging out with beggars and cripples and cheats and liars and deceivers when you know like that's not good for our reputation. That's not the place you want to be. And it's trusting like, okay, Jesus, I'm going to surrender my appearance. I'm going to surrender the things that people think about me to you. And I'm going to be in the place where you've called me to be. Giving up control, surrendering your life is giving up everything that you own to follow after an unknown rabbi that says, come and follow me. Surrendering and giving up control is like the Old Testament stories of kings and leaders going into battle with only half the troops that they think they need because Jesus has said, trust me. God has said, trust me. And it's like, I wouldn't plan it this way. But I'm going to surrender and I'm going to follow after God. Giving up control, surrendering is trusting a prostitute for your safety in a land that is wanting to hunt you down and kill you. Surrendering, giving up control is saying goodbye to the land that you've always known for a land that God promises is better once you get there. Surrendering and giving up control someday, believing that your old wife, like really old, like ancient wife, can somehow someday produce offspring that God is going to build an entire nation through. Because that's not how you do it. Giving up control is the hardest thing to do, and yet that's what we are asked to do, to give up our lives, to surrender and carry the cross, to die to ourselves as Jesus died for us. If we look at Jesus, we see the ultimate act of surrender. We see the ultimate act of giving up your life for something greater. The way of Jesus is surrender. The way of Jesus is upside down. The way of Jesus leads to freedom and healing. It leads to hope and help. It leads to a different kind of life. And that is the life that you are invited into today. Jesus died after living a perfect life so that you and I might live. And if today you're sitting here feeling like, man, I'm going through the motions. Am I really living? Like I'm just struggling to get by. Jesus died so that you don't have to keep living that way. Jesus hung on a cross after being accused, arrested, questioned, beaten, abused, mocked, and he died on that cross, not because he deserved it, but because we deserved it. And he did that so that we don't have to take that kind of punishment ourselves. He took our place. He took your place so that you might live. And he says, you will live when you die to yourself, when you surrender, when you give up control, when you let go of your plans, your dreams, your hopes. The way of Jesus, it's upside down. And so imagine with me right now, what happens if we begin to surrender? It can be overwhelming, I get it, to say like, I'm just going to surrender all of it right now because like, especially if we're control freaks, like it's really hard to just give it all up. And so if we were to surrender just one little thing today, can you imagine how that might change your life? Imagine how surrendering your relationship to your significant other might change that relationship. Imagine how surrendering your finances to the creator of the universe might actually help you see like you are blessed and that you can be a blessing. Imagine if you were to surrender your health concerns, the struggles, and you said, God is going to use this and use my story to make a difference in somebody else's story. Imagine that. Imagine all the burden that's released. Imagine if you were to surrender parenting your kids and said, Jesus, help me parent them. I give my kids to you. Imagine how your life would change if you surrendered your work and said, Jesus, I do this work because you've allowed me to do this work. Help me to do it well. Imagine what would happen if you surrendered your ministry to the Creator, to the God that loves you and sees you and calls you His own. Imagine the change that might be sparked because you said, it's not my plans, it's not my hopes, it's not my dreams. This is God's ministry. Imagine how many lives might be changed. Imagine how Milwaukee County might be changed. Imagine how the southeastern part of Wisconsin might be changed. The neighboring states might be changed. Our country might be changed if we start to surrender little bits of our lives to Jesus today. Things would definitely turn out differently. We would be blessed. Opportunities that were once limited by who we are and in our limited imaginations would become limitless. They become better because Jesus would be at the center of those things. And ultimately, that's what God hopes for, is that He would be at the center of all things, that we would surrender, that we would step into this upside down way of living, this upside down way of Jesus, that we would find direction and purpose and meaning because we surrender. That's what God has for each of us today. And so the answer to this question of can I do it? Or should I do it? It's yes. Yes, you should. It's yes, I'm going to surrender one small thing at a time. It's yes, Lord, I'll take you at your word. Yes, Lord, I will follow. Yes, Lord, I surrender. I know we can surrender. And I know when we do that, God's going to do great things in us and through us. Let's start that change today. Let me pray for us. God, we are so, so grateful for the ultimate example of surrender. A life laid down so that we might live. God, would we also surrender our lives? Would we die to ourselves the same way that you have died? So that we can experience the filling up, the blessing, the good things that come when we step fully into the plans and the purposes and the dreams that you have for us. God, would we choose to surrender, not just today, but would we choose to surrender on Monday when we step back into the reality of that work week? Would we choose to surrender on Tuesday when our kid does something that we're just not okay with? God, would we choose to surrender on Wednesday when we get that bill and it's more than we thought it was going to be, and we've got to choose to trust you with our finances? On Thursday, God, would we surrender when our marriage feels like it's fallen apart? Would we surrender on Friday when we get the news that our tests at the doctor came back different than we hoped for? And God, on Saturday, would we surrender again all the things in our schedule, all the things that we feel busy with, and say, Jesus, help me rest. Help me do life different. Help me experience more and more of you. Give us the strength, the courage, and the boldness to do something crazy this week, God. We pray this in your name. Amen.